Welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be going through how to get more treats from your owner. So I've put together a little spreadsheet that we're going to go over. It basically goes through using your cute face, using your dancing paws and things like that to really make the most out of the treats that you can get from your owner. It's Tutorial Tuesday! Welcome back to Tutorial Tuesday, where every single week, every single Tuesday, you get a brand new, fresh photography tutorial. Now this week, we're talking all about subframing, which is a great compositional technique that you can add to your photos. This works for portrait photography, works really well for portrait, works really well for landscape. You can add it to almost any type of photography, personal, professional. It just adds something to your photo. Now, just like any technique, you don't want to overuse it. There's always that danger, but it's a really useful tool to have. It can really add something. It helps with adding depth, adding layers, adding extra visual interest to your photo. So let's just dive right in to how you're supposed to capture this kind of technique. So let's start by talking about what subframing actually is. Well, essentially it's using a frame within your photo to actually frame the part of your photo that is the subject. So framing your subject within the photo using something like a structure, a foreground element that's blurred out but kind of frames your subject. It could be trees, it could be bushes, it could be flowers. You can get a bit more subtle about it and use light. You can use light to frame your subject in very interesting ways. There's loads of different things you can do with subframing, but it essentially guides the viewer's eye through your photo to your subject and shows them exactly which part of the photo they're supposed to be looking at. It can also add a foreground element to add a bit of layering and a bit of depth to your photo. It can add a visual interest and actually a splash of color or something like that. It's a very, very useful technique to have in your photography tool bag. So to achieve this technique, you're going to need something to frame your subject. So a very easy way to get started with this, if you've never done it before, is to shoot through something. So let's say you're doing portrait photography. You set your subject up over behind some trees or some flowers or some bushes, and then you shoot through those leaves, those flowers, shoot through that and create this natural frame that's going to be very, very nice. It's a very easy way of showing this is my subject. It guides the viewer's eye through the photo to your subject, but it's a very useful way of really emphasizing your subject there. It also adds that visual interest. So let's take the flowers, for example. It adds a splash of color to your photo. It adds a foreground element, so it's not just a flat image. Then you've got a foreground, which is your flowers in this case, a middle ground, which is your subject, and then that blurred out background. So you've got 3 layers to your photo, a really nice bit of depth in there. Now you can do this with landscape as well. There's nothing to stop you doing that, especially if you're pinpointing one area of a landscape. You can try shooting through some leaves, shooting through some grass, anything to just give you a bit of a foreground element to kind of separate the foreground, the middle ground, and really frame that landscape. Again, it just stops it from looking flat and boring. It's just a very useful thing to be able to do. Similarly, structures can be great because they provide very natural styles of framing. So archways, doorways, even just walls, any of that can create some really nice framing. So for example, in this photo, I'm using the natural structure and the leading lines of the kind of pathway that we're standing on to frame my subject in the middle of the photo. So it's not your typical super obvious framing that we've been looking at already. It's a little bit more subtle. He is framed by the pathway. So it's more of a background element that is creating the frame. And that's something you can definitely experiment with. You don't always have to be super literal with your framing. So for example, you don't always have to use an actual archway or an actual doorway. You can use light or use a background element to create a slightly more subtle frame. Now light's a very interesting one. So in this photo, I've got my model standing there and there's just that beam of light on her face, just kind of across her eyes. Now that leads you directly, immediately to those eyes, and we're framing her eyes using the light. You can also use light in a very creative way. So in this photo, everything is silhouetted and the lighthouse is only really visible because of the slightly brighter sky behind. So it's kind of framed by the leaves of the trees, but it's also framed against that sky. The sky is almost framing the lighthouse. So you can use backlighting in that really interesting way as well to kind of frame your subject. Now you can combine the two things we've spoken about, so using light and shooting through things, to create a really nice kind of bokeh light framing system. So for example, in this photo, I'm using fairy lights to frame my subject. I've got my fairy lights set up so that my camera is right up against them, shooting through the fairy lights to my subject. And it creates this really nice kind of warm frame of light around her face. Now, as I mentioned before, it doesn't always have to be a foreground element that frames your subject. You can use natural things in the background to create a more subtle frame around your subject. That can work really, really well. And something that's great to look out for, especially if you're doing urban photography, or if you're doing anything like that, is to look for natural kind of gaps. So whether it's an alleyway, whether it's a doorway, an archway, or just a natural shape that you can use to frame your subject or subjects. It can be a really useful way of telling the story. It can be a really powerful way to either tell a story within your photo, guide the viewer's eye, like I've said about 1,000 times, I think, and ultimately just make your photo more interesting. Now here's a little pro tip that I like to use sometimes. When I want to use a framing technique, but there's no good option for how I'm gonna set up something to be a foreground element, set up something to be a background element, and create this frame, I sometimes take little props with me so that I can create a frame literally while holding the camera. So for example, I'll take red or yellow leaves or even green leaves in the summer, and I'll just sort of hold them up in front of my camera when I snap the picture. And it's as if I've shot through this bush or this foliage of some sort, but there wasn't actually anything there. I just held this up a little bit to get that effect. Now this is a super useful thing to be able to do, because if you are planning on doing framing while you're on a shoot, and it's just not working, either the tools aren't at hand, you know, there's nothing there to use to frame your subject, this is a great way of being able to do that, being able to make it work. Now, I hope you found this a little bit helpful. If you do have any questions about framing at all, pop it down in the comments and I'll go back to you ASAP. I'll pop a full list of all the equipment used in this video for the different photos and stuff like that down in the description so you can check that out. If you have any tips of your own for kind of creating a frame within a photo, pop them down in the comments as well, because I love reading through those. Now, this is Tutorial Tuesday, but of course, it is part of our Christmas content advent calendar. If you've missed it so far, we've got a new video every day through to the 24th of December. There's cool new stuff, there's fun new stuff. It's a lot of tutorials, to be honest. So if you like Tutorial Tuesday, I'd check out all the ones for the last few days, because it's basically been tutorial every day. So I'd go and check that out. I will see you tomorrow. Make sure to like the video and subscribe and all that cool stuff. Honestly though, do make sure to do that. It really helps me out. I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, thanks for watching.